Hello, the day is January the 14th, and Mercury has just stationed retrograde in a perfect, well, I would say perfect, to the degree square to Uranus and Taurus. Um, to fill this in a bit more, Mercury shares Aquarius right now with the planet Saturn. Mercury stationed retrograde degrees away from Saturn, so it's in the process now of backing up, moving away from Saturn. It will back up into Capricorn before eventually making its forward motion push back towards Saturn and Aquarius. Um, I think that this retrograde is a particularly interesting one to do in the format of a 12 sign horoscope because it doesn't just give us a look at Mercury retrograde itself, but rather because it's stationing in a perfect square to Uranus, it sort of illuminates the Uranus Saturn square, which has been going on basically all last year, and it carries on being an important dynamic in 2022. So by looking at this Mercury retrograde, which is starts off in a perfect square to Uranus, it is definitely a Mercury retrograde that is referential to the Saturn Uranus dynamic that's going on. And so I think it's helpful to look at a 12 sign horoscope video like the one I'm about to make as not just something that talks about Mercury retrograde, but also gives us a sense of what this Saturn Uranus dynamic that we've been in the middle of for the last couple of years is all about. Um, Now, I have made a bunch of notes, so I don't necessarily even have to pull up my wheel here. I can just kind of do it off the top of my head, but I think it may be good as a visual aid to display the wheel, so I'm going to do that. Okay, so we're starting off with Aries rising, and I have removed all the planets from the picture except for Saturn and Uranus and Mercury. So it's simple, and so you won't get bogged down with all the other stuff that's not relevant to what I'm talking about. Um, Now, the way I'm doing this, first of all, we'll look at Mercury stationing retrograde together with Saturn there in the 11th house. In this Aries rising chart, the 11th house is associated with Aquarius. The 11th house has to do with groups, organizations, and generally supportive people who are there to help you on your way to achieving your goal. Now, with the Saturn influence there, Saturn is well dignified in its own sign. I'll give you that. But the Saturn itself is a kind of a difficult planet. In this sense, it may represent a kind of an obstacle or a difficulty in the Aries chart relating to the topic of groups and organizations. I'm thinking that it's like that whole saying that, if you're an artist, sometimes it's not about the quality of the work that you do, it's about who you know and what kind of connections that you have. And are you in there with the right people? Have you done the right networking that you need to do? Or, maybe you're an astrologer like I am, a working professional astrologer, and your ability to make money has to do with your social connections. If your career goal has to do with drawing in clients, then if you don't have any connection to any clients, then you're not, you don't have that pool to draw from to make your money. And I would say that specifically this whole thing about who you know and are you able to use your connections profitably is especially relevant for the Aries rising chart because Uranus is in the second house relative to the Aries rising chart. the second house has to do with making money. Can you support yourself? Can you get an income off of what you do? And so there's a question where there's a demand perhaps to have more financial independence, that kind of thing, and yet the having a Saturn ruled 11th house with Saturn there sort of suggests like an obstacle or an impediment to making these sorts of social networking connections that you need to profit off your business. So in this Mercury retrograde process, Mercury will be retrograding into the 10th house of Capricorn, and the 10th house has more to do with the actual practice of what it is that you do, whether that's what you do for money or what you do in your day-to-day life, the work you do that takes up most of your time day to day. And so what I see for an Aries rising chart is that in the Mercury retrograde process, the shift will be taken off of, do I know all the right people, to actually focusing on doing the work itself. And then eventually the Mercury will station and come back. And I think it's an opportunity right now to refocus rather on, am I impressing all the right people and making all the right connections, but to actually focus on the merits of the work itself and the actual getting things done and doing what you got to do. And that will kind of relieve that kind of pressure of trying to go making all the social connections, and then maybe you can like come back and approach that and you've got a new portfolio to show off because you've been putting the time in doing the work, right? That's kind of what I am getting from the Aries rising chart anyways. I'm going to move on to the next one now. Now, this is for Taurus risings. And this one is interesting specifically because it has Uranus in the first house. And the first house has all about to do with you, your self-image, your self-identity, the role you play in the world, that kind of thing. And the tension here is between that angular first house and the angular 10th house, which all has to do with the work that you do in the world. If you're going through this video watching all the different signs, even though they're not yours, then you will have heard me talk about that in my one I did for Aries just recently. But basically, with that Saturn there in Aquarius in the 10th, it puts there's a kind of a heavy Saturnian vibe coming associated with the daily workaday life, the daily grind, all the responsibilities that you have to do to make sure everything's whatever, or sorted out, settled, organized, all the work is taken care of, but it's either a big job or it just demands a lot for you, or it's something that could be starting to become kind of tedious, maybe kind of boring, maybe kind of repetitive, maybe mundane. It could be kind of just seem like a drag, and there is a tension there from Uranus, which is a lot more, I'm treating Saturn here to be a kind of cold, gray, not very exciting, kind of wintry, drudgery kind of planet, whereas Uranus is sort of challenging that kind of dynamic with maybe the promise of a kind of a reinvention. And in the first house, you could say it's kind of a self-reinvention, or maybe a kind of a rediscovery of self even. That maybe, in contrast to the drudgery of the workaday life of that Saturn in the 10th, that Uranus in the first house is sort of like kind of teasing that, like, come on, there's more to life than this, right? Like, it's not all just this drudgery workaday life. And I think what's interesting here is that with Mercury now stationing retrograde in this square, Mercury's headed back to the ninth house, actually, of Capricorn. And the ninth house has all to do with things like dreams and visions, as well as spiritual experiences, and also things to do like higher learning and education and stuff like that. But Mercury is in this position where it may be kind of like worn out by the drudgery of the workaday life of that Saturn Aquarius 10th house stuff, and I would see this as a nice opportunity to maybe take a break and get a kind of a renewal of inspiration, whether that is, I don't know, going on like a meditation retreat or taking some time to yourself. And I think that the first house in Uranus, when you put that together with where Mercury's headed to the ninth, there's some theme there about self-discovery, about how maybe you might be seeing the external world as being a kind of thing that's demanding a lot from you, and you have to show up and be dutiful and all this and that. But what about the inner world? And that there may be some inner discovery to be made, that maybe brings up a kind of you find the wellspring of your enthusiasm, and you to bring that back to your dealings in the world around you. So I think that it could be a very positive thing for Taurus rising people in terms of looking within and self-reflection and that kind of thing. That's what I get from this Mercury retrograde for a Taurus rising. Now, Gemini rising is interesting to me because Saturn in Aquarius lands in the ninth house. Now, the ninth house has to do with things like travel, schoolwork, higher education, as well as if you're a Gemini rising that is particularly invested in your spiritual life, the ninth house has to do with spirituality. So there could be some kind of difficult lesson here related to ninth house stuff. And, you have to kind of just play off of whatever it fits to be the most relevant for you. For some people, maybe an easy, mundane explanation could be something to do with, if you're going to university and you're hitting a particularly difficult period in the material you're handling, and or something like that. Here, Uranus is making the square to it from the 12th house, and there is the 12th house is also interesting because the 12th house has to do with kind of like hermitude, isolation, and so that there could be like in here, rather than like Uranus is challenging, has this quality of challenging someone to break free, but it's in a place which is not generally associated with freedom unless it's a spiritual freedom because it's the 12th house. And a lot of the times in mundane explanations of the 12th house, we talk about things like being imprisoned or being put in a hospital or being, you have some injury and you're stuck in bed or something. Like, this is all very 12th housey stuff. It's not, it seems like you're more constrained than you are liberated, at least in your material circumstances. But there's some way, I think, by constraining the material circumstances that we may have more of an opportunity again to look within. But there's something about that Saturn in the ninth that it's particularly, there's something here as a particularly difficult lesson. Now remember, like, Saturn's related to Saturn returns, which happens when you turn 30 and 60, around there. So there's kind of like a sense of maturity, and there's a sense of growing into this sort of like Senex crone kind of Saturnine wisdom in the ninth house, but we're not quite ready for it yet. And so if you look at where Mercury is going, Mercury is retrograding back into the 8th house, actually, which is, I interpret the 8th house primarily to do with things like debts and dependencies and things like that. So, I mean, if you apply this to, like, if you're a university student, you might be looking at your student loans maybe by going back into the eighth house rather than the actual workload itself, and kind of and looking at some of that stuff. But I mean, it could also be, I think it could be seen as an opportunity for purification, perhaps, because I look at it, all these little things that you'd be dependent on, right? Or that if there's something about that Saturn in the ninth house that you don't want to face, this retrograde could be about all sorts of like subtle forms of escapism, or ways that we kind of get out from having to face whatever it is that we're facing, and that this retrograde could take us through all that stuff and show us where we're still kind of like hanging on to these things that we're dependent on for whatever reason, and that could be things like substance use, it could be things like, internet addiction, it could be like dependency on unhealthy relationships, like codependency dynamics. There could be a lot of different things here that would be relevant depending on your situation. And so the Mercury retrograding back to the eighth house, I see as, you're going to be taking a look at all that stuff, and that's kind of that's kind of more of a distraction from the primary. You deal with the distractions, and then you sort it out. Then you have to face Saturn, whatever lesson Saturn is trying to come through for you. You have to deal with the lessons of dependency and addiction, and whether you're owing debts. It could also be even like making amends or something like that. There's some sort of unfinished business that you feel like you have to settle before you can move forward. That's also could be something like, eighth house is kind of spooky. I'm thinking like ghosts, and ghosts linger around because of eighth unfinished business. I'm not saying that you're gonna have to literally deal with ghosts or anything, but that maybe you're like a ghost and you have something that you feel like you need to settle before you can move on in life. That could be something relevant for Gemini risings. Now, the eighth house is generally not seen to be a very positive house. And one of the reasons why that is, if you're using the theme of Monday, which is a Cancer rising, as similar to the arrangement that we have here, the eighth house is in aversion to the ascendant, which means that it's kind of like a blind spot. One of the ways that Saturn has been described as well has been this sort of unconscious area. And so when I see Saturn in the eighth house, for me, it kind of doubles up this thing about like an unconscious blind spot. Another thing about the eighth house is eighth house has to do with things like loss, fear of loss, and stuff like that, death, and what comes from death. And Saturn, it was kind of interesting because it's the original image of Saturn actually included a scythe, like a grim reaper kind of character, and actually that symbol with that kind of like, it's almost like an H symbol, is actually apparently related to the scythe imagery of Saturn. And so for me, all this kind of stuff gets emphasized when you have Saturn in Aquarius in the eighth house, things to do either with the kind of fear of death, fear of loss, or of some kind of a blind spot of something that we're unconscious of, that we're not able to see, and because of our ignorance, it has some sort of power over us. Now, the 11th house in this chart has Uranus and Taurus making the square, and the 11th house has to do with groups, your social network, people who are helping you achieve your goals and such. And it could be that the Uranus is challenging Saturn here in such a way that's like the groups of friends or of different, you could also be like institutions or something, but there's some sort of like helpful influence in your life that has some sort of social presence that maybe that people can see that you are having a hard time maybe grieving a loss, or maybe there is some kind of pattern that you're really stuck in, but you are really unaware or unconscious of it. And that you could, I would say, for Cancer rising, to basically try to listen to what your friends and what your support network would be trying to tell you or give you hints, or what's coming up in those kinds of interactions. Because what I'm inclined to see from a chart like this is that perhaps your social support, these groups that you're part of, may be able to see things going on that in your life that you are ignorant about, unaware of, or unconscious of. And so with this heavy eighth house dynamic, I would say that it could even be a something to do with shadow work. And perhaps that could even illuminate what it means when Mercury heads back into Capricorn, which for a Cancer rising individual, Capricorn would be the seventh house. The seventh house has to do with partnerships and relationships. But it's also said that the seventh house is also a ripe place for shadow work, because most often we encounter the shadow as a projection onto the other. Whereas, it's you would be surprised perhaps how difficult it can be to come to terms with our own flaws and our own problems and our own whatever. Whereas, you see that in somebody else, and, it's like, because it's not you, it's more easier to be critical of that showing up in another person. So, and in a Cancer rising chart, it's also interesting to note that both the 8th house and the 7th house are both Saturn signs, which means that there's probably more of an association with that for Cancer rising people than other people. So I think there's something here to be said for paying attention to your friends and your people from groups and stuff like that with that 11th house influence. But Mercury is going to be doing this journey that goes backwards into the 7th. So you're going to head backwards into something about relationships maybe, or about partnerships or close friendships even, I think applies to the 7th house. And there could be something that you have the tendency to project onto the other person, and that this Mercury retrograde could be a useful opportunity for recovering those projections and getting some self-insight based on seeing what's reflected to you from other people. This is a very psychological take on Cancer rising, but that's just what it brings up for me. I'll move to the next one now. Now, Leo is the opposite sign to Aquarius. So, in a Leo rising chart, Saturn in Aquarius lands in the 7th house of Aquarius, which has all to do with partnerships and relationships. Now, this could have something to do with difficulties or obstacles in a relationship. Saturn, I think, is actually an important planet when it comes to relationships, because there are certain things that you can associate with Saturn here, such as commitment, whether a relationship lasts the test of time, since Saturn is the slowest moving of the traditional 7 planets. Saturn has a lot to do with longevity and of responsibility and duties and making a commitment and all that kind of stuff. However, when it comes to relationships, I mean, often when we're attracted to things, we're attracted, maybe because the person's like funny and charming or attractive, or you think you might have a good time with them. I don't know how many people are necessarily attracted by the prospect of lifelong partnership and commitment and stuff like that. Maybe some people are. Maybe it's my own Sagittarius coming through that has an aversion to those kinds of things. But I think that there's something about that Saturn in the seventh which is particularly challenging because it represents the stuff about relationships which, it's, if you can make it work, they stand the test of time. Like if you're okay with just being committed to one person and not, and saying goodbye to your single life. That's another thing. Saturn's kind of like an end, right? So it's like if you're okay with like hanging up your single life, and being a committed partner and basically, onward into middle age and losing your whatever, getting, if you're a woman you get like menopause or something. I don't know, this is what I'm getting from like the Saturn in the seventh anyways. There could be, it doesn't necessarily have to do with partnerships and relationships. It could have to do with, friendships or close, I guess that's still a relationship, you know what I mean? But it doesn't necessarily have to be a romantic, sexual kind of boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever gay romance. It doesn't have to be romantic necessarily. But there's something there about aging and standing the test of time, and there being a kind of drudgery to it, which may be difficult to face. And in the midst of all this, you're also getting a square from Uranus in Taurus, and which has to do with, which it's in the 10th house, which has to do with your work life, your day-to-day routine and such. And I think it would be particularly interesting we're talking about a Leo rising person whose work involves working one-on-one with clients. If that's relevant to you and you have real Leo rising, then all this stuff about Saturn might not have to do with relationships so much, but your client work, actually. Like, I mean, I've heard people even say things like a lawyer works with his clients on a big case. Your clients are going to be showing up in the seventh house here. Or if you're, even if you're an astrologer like I am, if I am an astrologer and, there may be, the seventh house may be saying something about the clients that I work with, but the 10th house is more to do with the work. The seventh house has to do with the other person, and there's some sort of like tension here. Like it's like with Uranus in Taurus, there's a push for a breakthrough in your professional life. Then that also has to do with the pinnacle of your success. It's like the highest point of the chart. So it's kind of like your ability to get recognition and fame and what you're known for. And there's a kind of a push there, but the actual, maybe it could also, like, seventh house could be a business partnership where like maybe you're partnered up with the wrong person or something like that. And there's some sort of tension between your desire to make some career breakthrough versus who you're partnered up with or something. Or maybe in another situation, maybe your romantic personal relationships have become a kind of a burden of responsibility, and that you see your career as actually something that could be bringing you more liberation and more innovation and more exciting breakthrough. But it's like maybe your wife just got sick too. And so you've got these sort of things playing off each other where you've got to be responsible for somebody who's sick, but then you're feeling like that's detracting from your own aspirations for career and achievement and stuff like that. So Mercury is going to be retrograding into the 6th house, and the 6th house has, it's like the blood, sweat, and tears house. Let's face it. Like, it's like the solution. Though I don't even know if this is about what's right or what's wrong. This isn't about saying that this is what you should be doing or what you shouldn't be doing. This is just giving you a view of where the energy is going to be flowing. and it's flowing in this direction of the sixth house, which is like grunt work, which is putting the blood, sweat, and tears in to just grind it out, basically. And because the sixth house is in a trine to the 10th house, then, but you could put a lot of work in and maybe see some real breakthroughs with your career and stuff like that. But could be I think the key here is to watch out that all this promise of some sort of innovation or breakthrough isn't just a mode of distraction from the realities that Saturn is indicating, which may not be so easy to face, and that this whole thing about going back to Capricorn and grinding it out and working hard, it seems like, sure, in our, with our Protestant work ethic and our hardworking society, it may seem like a very, well dignified and meritable course of action, but I think it's it could just be work in the sense of a detour or distraction away from a bigger kind of thing that we have to face, as implied with Saturn there, right? But another hand, though, is that Saturn ruled Aquarius. Saturn also rules Capricorn, so maybe the work in the sixth house may not just be a distraction away from this Saturn stuff, but if you can find a way to make your hard work applicable to your relationship problems or your partnership issues, rather than just using work as an escapism, then maybe that could be a more productive way to handle this pattern that's coming up here. Now, this is an interesting one for Virgos because with a Virgo rising chart, Aquarius and Saturn land in the sixth house, which is all about work, chores, maybe some health issue stuff coming up. But if you think about the sixth house, a lot of it has to do with these things that we work on, but we never seem to make any progress with. It's not that it's impossible to make progress, but the nature of the work is such that it's like you just have to keep doing it. And I think chores are a good example of illustrating this, because it's like if you're doing laundry, it's only a matter of time before you have more laundry to do. If you do dishes, you might have all your dishes clean, but they're not going to stay that way for very long. If you have to do exercise to keep yourself healthy, it's not like you can just be like, oh, well, I will just run 100 miles and then I can check that one off the list and I don't have to exercise again. You know what I mean? It's like exercise and keeping yourself healthy isn't about just doing one thing. It's about having a habit that you do all the time, and whether or not to keep up that habit. You know what I mean? With Saturn and Mercury retrograde in the sixth, there's kind of like this thing about there's this stuff. I think the exercise thing works because it could be like, we're in January here. It could be like a New Year's resolution that you could be like, I'm going to go for a jog like every single day and get in shape and all this kind of stuff. And now it's 2 weeks in and the reality is starting to hit you like, fuck jogging, pardon the expression, or whatever it is, right? And you're just like, you're hitting the wall basically at this point. And Mercury retrograde kind of shows this inclination to, maybe time to go in the other direction, right? Mercury's heading back towards the fifth house, and the fifth house has more to do with play and leisure and recreation and stuff like that. So it could be taking a well-needed break to have some fun and actually enjoy life, whereas the sixth house is more to do with hard work. Now, what's interesting about a Virgo rising chart is that Capricorn and Aquarius are both ruled by Saturn. So in some way, they may not be so disconnected after all. Like maybe there could be a way to bring more fun into this sixth house stuff, which could be either a change of attitude where you're not treating, maybe you have to do the dishes, but you can like put on some music and you can sort of like still have some good time or whatever while you do the dishes. Or that maybe, maybe you're hitting a wall. There's some way to make it more fun, basically, right? I haven't mentioned Uranus yet, and Uranus is in the 9th house, which has to do with things like dreams and visions, as well as spirituality. Maybe in a more mundane sense, it could do with higher education, like going to school and stuff like that. Now, I see it with that square between the 9th and the 6th, that the 6th is all about kind of like this grounded, practical, what are the things I need to do to get done? What do I need to do to keep myself healthy? It's very much about the brass tacks of the work that we have to do, whereas the 9th has more to do with our principles, our guiding vision. We could be doing all this work, but what is the point? What's the reason why we're doing this anyways? If we don't have a kind of a vision of where we're going in life, it may not seem like we're going anywhere. It may seem that we're doing all this work just to tread water. And like, unless you can at least throw in some fun stuff once in a while, what's the point? I feel like this is kind of what Uranus is saying in this conversation, that Uranus is sort of challenging the hard-working attitude to be like, yeah, but hard work, but for what? What are you working for? What is your motivation? What is your principle that makes this worth doing? Is there some, and I mean, you could just say that, is it guided by like, I have to like keep my house clean because other people will think that I'm a slob and I will just be a worthless piece of crap human being? That's not really like a motivating reason to do. That's like being afraid of some sort of negative consequence, or people are going to reject you or something. It's not really a motivating, breakthrough into a higher state of consciousness, if that's what is leading your motivation in life, I would say, right? Uranus, in the 9th here, I feel like you have to have some sort of higher principle, and that there's a tension between Saturn and Uranus where it's like, there's got to be something more than just being dutiful and being responsible and getting it done and taking good care. But for what though, right? Why? What's the big picture of why even bother with this in the first place? I feel like that has a lot to do with the conversation between Uranus and Saturn. And the good news, anyways, is that at least with this retrograde into the 5th house, you're getting a bit of a opportunity to lighten up and have a bit of fun, or maybe, a reprieve from the heaviness of the Saturn influence. In a Libra rising chart, Saturn in Aquarius falls in the 5th house. This I don't see as being a very good place for Saturn to be, because 5th house generally has to do with things like play and children and having fun and lighthearted stuff. And all of this is more or less antithetical to what Saturn is all about. Saturn is about old age, things that are serious, responsibilities. It's basic in some way. If you look at the archetype of the puer senex, where the puer is the eternal youth and the senex is like the old man, it's sort of like sticking the senex in puer territory, which is a kind of a mismatch. So as such, the 5th house, which is all about play and having fun and what's enjoyable in life, and appreciating the good things and all this kind of stuff is weighed down by a Saturn, which you could read this in relation to the pandemic, that it's like we've got to be responsible and we can't spread our germs around, and so all this fun stuff has to be put on hold. That could be an easy way to explain the dynamic that we're all familiar with in showing up in a Libra rising chart. There's certain specific things going on in the Libra rising chart, though. Like, you've got Uranus in Taurus making that square to Mercury stationing retrograde, and Uranus in Taurus is in the 8th house. Now, the 8th house has to do with a lot of different things. Oftentimes it has to do with death and fear of loss, or dependencies and debts and things like that. When I look at the 8th house and a Uranus in the 8th house squaring off against a Saturn in the 5th house, what comes to mind for me is that the Saturn may act as an obstacle, which makes it difficult to have fun, to lighten up, and just enjoy yourself. And Uranus is seeking to try to break through this sort of stagnation, the sort of sense of just being stuck with this Saturn thing that isn't changing anytime soon. And the quality of the 8th house is to look for a way out, a way to remediate the problem. And I think there are certain things that could be relevant to the 8th house, such as drug and alcohol abuse, for one thing, comes to mind. Or maybe, other types of addictions could be having the same thing. Like, it could be, you don't have to be doing drugs and alcohol. It could be like a gambling addiction. I don't know if that would be my first choice, though. I'm not really the type of guy to have a gambling addiction, but maybe there's such a, like, the 5th house is like, in different times, 5th house could be associated with gambling because it's something to do with, it's like the play of it, like you're playing a game and you're having fun, and and the money is there to just sort of make it a bit like more exciting or something, but it's in the spirit of play. But when you've got Saturn there putting a big damper on your play zone, then you might be looking towards some sort of way out, a way to escape that. And so Uranus comes in to say, like, well, there's nothing really going on here, but at least we can get high, or, like, maybe I'll start playing online poker and I'll just give me a distraction so I don't have to worry about how depressing things are. It kind of gives me some stimulation. But it's like the 8th house has this quality of kind of like digging yourself a hole, right? Like, you're kind of like creating a debt for yourself, whether you owe somebody money or whether maybe your own health is suffering from it, right? Like, maybe you're like, well, nothing fun's going on, so I'll just drink a lot, and then you start having liver problems or something, right? Like, that is the kind of thing that I don't really necessarily see Uranus as being a very positive influence in the Libra rising chart, because its relation in the 8th house, and that's basically what comes up for me when I try to think of a square between the 5th and the 8th, is this sort of pattern of, like, I'm not just talking about squares between the 5th and 8th in general. This specific thing that we've got going on right here, to me, it's like using things like drugs or alcohol or all these sort of things as a way to get what you're not getting from the 5th house, right? Like, you're like, Venus has joy in the 5th house, right? So, we want things which are beautiful, which are pleasurable, which are nice, and all we get instead is this cranky old man Saturn vibe. And you're just like, and then Uranus is in the Venus ruled sign of Taurus, saying, like, Saturn really isn't delivering for when it comes to this nice Venusian stuff. Maybe maybe we got some Uranian tricks up our sleeves that we can overcome this by, by this, that, but it's all just kind of substitutes. It's all looking for some way out to substitute for what isn't coming through just naturally in the fifth house. That's how I see it. And I haven't gone on to, but what happens when Mercury retrogrades into the fourth? The fourth house has to do with family and your ancestry and stuff like that. So this could be that in some way, in facing these problems, these tensions of either not having the joy or the fun in life, or maybe the search for that just leads to addictions and other problems, that there's an opportunity in the retrograde that we're retrograding into the fourth house, which has to do with family and stuff like that. And I don't know if this is a return trip to see the folks or to reach out to family that you may have become disconnected from. That may all fit for a Libra rising. Or maybe there could be some sort of like lesson, if you really want to go deep with it, maybe like a lesson from the ancestors even, right? That maybe there's some ancestral pattern that in your ancestors are calling out to get some message across, that you do not mess up your life in the way that they did with, drugs and alcohol addiction or whatever the case may be. There may be some, or you could find some more, if let's say, you're just turning to cheap thrills to fill the void, that maybe there's something in your own ancestral lineage which is missing that provides a more of a richer sustenance, more, you find what you're really missing, and that has something to do with being more in touch with your heritage or where you're from, or you get in touch with your roots. And then that gives you a sense of the soul that fills in the void in a more healthy way, right? That's more of a proper way to fill in what feels lacking than to turn to some sort of cheap substitute, right? That's what I get from a Libra rising chart anyways. In a Scorpio rising chart, Saturn in Aquarius lands in the fourth house, which has to do with things like home, ancestry, family, your roots, that kind of stuff. And we can see that the Saturn Uranus square is between that fourth house and the seventh house, which has to do with partnerships and relationships and things like that. Now, there could be a number of different ways that this could be interpreted. One thing that comes to mind is that I didn't want to make this video where I was casting Saturn as being overly negative, because I do think that even though it's the greater malefic, it's said to have it's said to be a difficult planet to deal with. That is we're more inclined to see Saturn as being a kind of a problem than, let's say, Venus or Jupiter, the benefic planets, which bring us nice things. But I mean, Saturn does have some advantages. It has to do with things like the structure, right? Like Saturn was related to things like the skeleton or the bones, or like the kind of foundation of stuff. And so when you've got Saturn in your fourth house, something to do with your actual home of where you're living, Saturn could imply a kind of a strong foundation, or a kind of a strong and stable kind of presence. And that, if you're putting that in the bottom of the chart, the fourth house, that's kind of like the base. If you saw the wheel as being propped up, it would be sitting on the fourth house, and like that would be a good place to have Saturn there, providing a nice kind of center of gravity, right? So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but there are other ways you could read Saturn too. Like Saturn also has to do with can also do with blind spots and ignorance and things you're not aware of and stuff like that. I mean, it also has to do with old age and things breaking down over time and being commitments and things like that. The main tension here with Saturn and Uranus is with Uranus in the seventh, which has to do with partnerships and relationships. So I would read this as being primarily a kind of a tension. Like, I mean, let's give some examples here. Like, you could be, let's say you are happily married with your partner and all this kind of stuff, but the two of you live in one of those tiny homes and that you want to have kids, but your home just does not support it at all. And so that there's some sort of like tension with your partner is like putting the gas on you to find a better place to live or something. Um, in another, another way you could look at it is that, maybe you're like me and you move back in with your mom. There's this thing where a lot of people, the millennial generation, apparently in the pandemic, have moved back in with their family and such. And while that may be positive in the sense of providing a sort of stable support, um, they may have some sort of insecurities around whether, dating or like that kind of stuff. And so I would see the Uranus in Taurus as being a kind of a provoking, you may be so stable and comfortable in that situation, but maybe you should switch things up, if like, for the sake of accommodating a partner into the situation, right? Um, there could also be other dynamics at play with Uranus and Taurus, and the Saturn in Aquarius being the living situation. In that, there could be some other dynamic that makes a kind of a tension or an incompatibility with the circumstances of living and the relationship itself. And in one example could be, like maybe you and your partner everything is cool with you guys, but maybe you have a problem with your roommate, and that whenever you bring your partner over, your roommate is giving you some grief, about whatever the case may be. I'm thinking, I don't know. I had a friend who told me that. Well, I mean, I'm not going to get into my friends' stories, but I'm just, like you can be having this huge fight with your roommates that you try to bring your partner over, but you're bringing them into a war zone or something like that, and it's just a mess or something. I mean, I would say I would expect Mars to be kind of more at play there, to be honest, though, right? I don't think Saturn is really about having a fight or a conflict. I mean, the square between Saturn and Uranus has that Mars nature to it, but that's just one thing, anyways. It could also be, like maybe your house works for you, but you're living with a bunch of drug addicts and alcoholics, and it's just, the people have different kinds of standards, right? Like maybe for some people it's like it's okay to live like that, but maybe you've got a new girlfriend and like you're like she's, a lot more clean cut or something like that. Like she's put her past, ways behind her, and would be absolutely horrified to see the kind of general squalor, of drunken roommates living like feral animals or something like that. And I think that could be relevant in that, like, another side of Saturn could be like this kind of like, untamed, feral, deprived kind of like, almost like, like Saturn could be like a military general that's all got his shit together and is very regimented and disciplined. But Saturn could also represent, like some homeless guy who's like smoking crack in the alley, who's complete, like these archetypes don't just stand for one simple thing. It could mean a whole bunch of other things. Like so you could have this problem where, like maybe you're younger and you want to bring your girlfriend over, but your dad is like the hard ass, drill sergeant guy, and you're like, oh man, or you get don't you want, or maybe your girlfriend's dad is like that, and you're like, oh man, if I get caught, fooling around with my girlfriend, that this Saturnine character is gonna be like, laying down the discipline on me or something, or else you could go over there to your girlfriend's house. Your girlfriend's living with her parents, and her dad is um, a meth head or something, right? And then you're like, oh, and it's not, you're not worried about some discipline coming down, but you're like, oh my God, like I've thought I've fallen in love with this woman, and yet if I get involved with her family is like, like they have a lot of problems, and it's just a mess. And like those could be very similar situations that deal with Saturn as an archetype, but playing out in different ways for different people. So there you go. There's a whole bunch of different ways that Saturn and Uranus are playing out in a Scorpio rising chart. Now, the Mercury retrograde comes in because, Mercury is going to be backing up into the third house, and the third house has more to do with the local neighborhood, as well as people who have a neighborly kind of relation. I also think the third house works in terms of friends. It may be in a way more so than the 11th house. Like, I think 11th house to me feels more like professional networking, whereas the third house is like your bros. I don't normally use the word bros, but because it's like it has to do with siblings and neighbors. But like if you have friends that are like your bros, that are kind of like of that, they're not literally your siblings, but that's the word that we would use, right? Like they're kind of like have that dynamic. They're not there necessarily to push you forward in your career, but they're the people you pal around with or something like that. There could be, anyways, Mercury is like finding this Saturn, whether Saturn is a disciplinarian or a crackhead or anything in between. Mercury, could be a difficult situation, and so Mercury is backing out of that to go visit the bros, or to go either that, or to go maybe perhaps searching, not being so stuck in the at-homeness of it, and getting out there into the neighborhood a bit more, and maybe finding different opportunities in the neighborhood, that kind of thing. And the third house is in a trine to the seventh house, so that would facilitate a more of a smooth kind of dynamic motion with Uranus there, as opposed to the square where there's more of a butting heads without such an easy resolution. There you get more of a chance to resolve things with the Capricorn Taurus dynamic, because they have that common earth element they're working on, where once you get into Aquarius Taurus, it's more of a problem. So there could be some creative potentials here, depending on how you work with the Mercury retrograde. For Sagittarius rising, Saturn in Aquarius lands in the third house. And the third house has to do with your local neighborhood, has to do with siblings, has to do with uncles, or people who have that kind of a relationship to you. Maybe your brothers and sisters, whether that's biologically or your bros or whatever, right? So when Saturn shows up here, it's saying something about those kinds of people in your life that are, let's say, near to you, whether that's being physically near or near relationally, are going to have a certain Saturnine kind of quality to them. Now, Saturn, in this sense, can stand for a number of things. It can be mature and responsible. It can also be slow. It can also be disabled or ill. It can also be old and feeble, or you know what I mean? Like there's certain qualities of Saturn which could be seen to be positive things, and there's certain qualities of Saturn to be seen as negative things. In the third house, though, it's primarily, I would say, going to be related to as a kind of a social thing. It could also be that your whole kind of social life under the weight of the pandemic has taken on a kind of Saturnine influence in that things are kind of restricted. If the third house has to do with your local neighborhood and you're traveling around day to day, that you may feel kind of stuck maybe in the same routine, or limited off, and that you're not socializing with your friends as neighbors and things like that as much as you would have liked, or that maybe the people that are around you seem to be kind of heavy and depressed, or not, not necessarily the people around you may not be the most perky, positive, fun influence. And if you look at the square that's taking place with Uranus and Taurus is in the 6th house, which is related to things like health and general chores and stuff like that. In another video, for another sign, I made the example that the sixth house is like, if you want to exercise, you're not just going to run 100 miles and then you're done exercising. That it's more about like a habit that you have to do consistently day to day, and it's by living in a certain healthy habit or healthy lifestyle that it shows its effect. But there is really, and it's endless. Like you can't just do it and then stop doing it, or else you'll just revert back, right? Like you have to keep doing this thing. And so with the Uranus in the 6th house, there is a tendency, I think, to expect or be aiming for some kind of breakthrough or improvement through the application of like consistent hard work, keeping up good habits and things like that. And there could be like a kind of a frustration with the Saturn quality that gets offloaded onto the 6th house stuff. Like maybe, an easy example could be like maybe the people that you're living with are sick or disabled or old or something like that. And so you feel like you have to pick up the slack for them. And then so that Uranus thing is like putting that energy into this sort of like grunt work of drudgery. Or, it could also be like that you're feeling kind of like very limited by the situation of the coronavirus and what you can do. Things seem to be fairly shut down in your local surroundings, in your neighborhood, in your town, and that one of the ways that you deal with that frustration is through maybe a kind of workaholism, if I'm saying that right, that you're trying to break through consistent work, basically. There's a certain sort of like Protestant work ethic that comes through, that if you just work hard enough, that you will see some kind of things will open up a bit, or even if even if your own efforts don't directly relate to, let's say, like coronavirus. Like it's not like you're going to be you work out the miracle cure that saves the world. You're just doing something like gardening or something like that, right? Like it's like by doing gardening, you're not going to be like directly solving the problem, but there's a kind of like an attitude that like maybe you could pass the time at least by working on a project or something, or that you could like it's something to do with your energy or something. What I think is interesting though for Sagittarius rising is that Mercury is going to retrograde into Capricorn, which is the second house. And the second house has all to do with making money, basically. So that I would imagine that maybe there's a way that you can play off of this sort of like sixth house thing going on with Uranus and Taurus, but like if you could play your cards right, maybe you could find a way that you can put this. You're kind of like sublimating your frustrations into work, but is that work actually profitable? Is it actually making you money? And that there maybe you can make some tweaks or adjustments where you're redirecting your efforts into something that actually, pays, right? I mean, not to say that money is the be all end all of what life is all about, but in this particular Mercury retrograde, that could be one of the perks that comes from it. Maybe is that you could reorient yourself towards making some money. I don't know. Okay, next one. For Capricorn rising, Saturn Aquarius falls in the second house, which is all to do with making money and your belongings and stuff. Now, like Saturn can play out in a number of different ways. For one thing, Saturn is well dignified in Aquarius, so in one way that it could play out is if you have a stable source of income. Saturn in Aquarius, if there's anything to be said about Saturn in its own domicile in a fixed sign, is that it could be stable and persistent in what it's doing. And when it comes to making money, being a sense of stability may not be such a bad thing. However, there are some other ways that Saturn could play out, in that Saturn often represents a kind of a blind spot or an obstacle or something that we're ignorant about. So it could show that there's some sort of like something, like if we're having problems making money, it could be some sort of area of ignorance that's holding you back in your business, whatever it is. It could also say something about the way that you make money is very Saturnian, which could be like you're in charge of something, like a boss, but it may not be very glamorous necessarily. It may be something where you've got a stable job that supports you well, but it's not exactly a fun thing. Maybe it has a lot of responsibilities that go with it. Maybe you have to take a kind of a role like a policeman or a military guy or something. I mean, I don't know. There are a lot of people in the world with Capricorn rising, and there could be a lot of different ways that these dynamics play out. The dynamic here is especially pronounced in the square between Saturn and Uranus, because Uranus finds itself in the fifth house, which has to do with play and children and having fun and enjoying life and all these good things, which is quite a different kind of vibe compared to what's going on with Saturn and Aquarius, which has more to do with a kind of a heavy sense of being dutiful and responsible and maybe being a breadwinner and making the money and doing what you got to do. But that's being challenged here by a Uranus, which says, don't forget to stop and smell the roses once in a while. Or like, what are you doing for fun? What is, what do you do to enjoy yourself? And these are two things which may seem, it's a good contrast, I would say, in this particular kind of chart. The Mercury is retrograding back into Capricorn, which of course is the first house in a Capricorn rising chart. And the first house has all to do with self-identity and things like that. So it's stationing retrograde with a square to Uranus, which is all about asking this kind of question, like asking this question about having fun and enjoying yourself and the pleasurable things of life, contrasting against the sense of being responsible and being the breadwinner and doing all the mature adult things you've got to do. And in that kind of question, which isn't about, I'm not trying to suggest that there's a right answer or one side is more important than the other, but in this contrast, there is a station retrograde and going back to the first house, going back to how you define yourself, going back to how you see yourself, going back to your own body even and your own physical needs. Like, are you grinding yourself to the bone, or maybe you could really use something, to have some fun or something like that. I would say that it's an interesting Mercury retrograde because it involves a certain kind of reappraisal of the situation and maybe some looking within and some soul searching and about how you define yourself. Do you define yourself as somebody who's all about business and about getting the important things done and being a responsible, mature person? And if you define yourself that way, then is there something that you're missing out of where you're not enjoying yourself enough? And then if you're enjoying yourself too much, is there some sort of practical, meeting your basic material needs that need to be looked at? There's a in the tension of this, it's sort of like how you see yourself relating to these areas of life. Are you more of this person or that person? Are you making a sacrifice in one area for the sake of another? And are these ideas that you have about yourself, these identifications, accurate? Are they helpful? Are they real? Are they true? Is it time to change? I think these are the Capricorn rising questions that need to be looked at. In an Aquarius rising chart, Saturn of Aquarius, of course, falls in the first house. So, this, even if we weren't talking about Mercury retrograde, if we weren't talking about a Saturn Uranus square, I think having a Saturn first house transit on its own is a pretty significant thing. This is because the first house has to do with you more than any other chart, more than any house in the chart. It's your self-identity, the impression you make upon other people, the quality that you have during this time of life when Saturn is making this impression here. Saturn is a planet that, for one thing, takes its joy in the 12th house, which has all to do about isolation. It's a planet that seemed to be more serious, not more adult, less playful and childlike, and more aged and adult. There may be a kind of mature Saturnine wisdom that comes with it, but it's a wisdom that has to do with things like learning the art of restraint, self-control, self-discipline, maybe a certain kind of austerity. And so with the first house, all of those qualities may be associated with you. You may be taking on these kinds of characteristics, which may be like the wise old man or the Senex. That's just another word for the same thing. You may be taking on qualities of a authoritarian, maybe. You may be taking on qualities of the hermit, which is isolated. Saturn can often be a kind of a wall. And so you may feel separate and isolated from other people as if there's a huge wall around you. And that may or may not have to do with the coronavirus pandemic. It could just be people have Saturn first house transits when we're not in a pandemic. So, there's other reasons which may factor into somebody going through a particularly hermit-like isolated time in their lives. Now, I don't know. I might be getting this completely wrong, but that's just how I am interpreting it. The square to Uranus is happening with Uranus in the 4th house of Taurus. So that has to do with your family, your ancestry, your home. And Uranus is said to have a kind of a destabilizing influence, being maybe a bit chaotic or disruptive. So in a chart like this, I would expect that there could be some sort of disruption that comes either to the physical home that you're living in. Like maybe you're renting a place and you find out that your landlord is kicking you out and you have to find a new place to live. That could be a basic, mundane interpretation. Maybe there is a shakeup in the family. Maybe one of your parents dies. I don't mean to get not to freak anybody out, though. I mean, I'm not saying this is definitely going to happen. I'm just saying it's a possible interpretation. Maybe your family, one of your parents dies and they live in like the other side of the country, and so there's this big thing like I have to go travel to the other side of the country to spread the ashes of my relatives or something like that. That creates a kind of a shakeup or something. Yeah, so there's a kind of like there's a kind of a dynamic shakeup thing happening with the 4th house, which is either going to be your home or your family. But meanwhile, you've got, if you're Aquarius rising, I would say that there's something about Saturn in the 1st house which implies that it's a fixed sign and Saturn is well dignified in its own sign. So there's probably more likely that you are kind of set in your ways, and it doesn't look like the most dynamic thing for you completely changing your identity and all this kind of stuff around. The more dynamic change seems to be coming from the 4th house, which has to do with either the physical place you're living or your family, or maybe some revelation about your ancestry, something that's more of like the wild card factor, whereas you are probably pretty stable in your usual habits. Mercury is going to go retrograde, though, and Mercury is going to retrograde into your 12th house, and the 12th house has a lot to do with isolation and solitude and things like that. Now, I don't know if this is just in terms of like the pandemic situation may have us a little bit more isolated than usual, but the 12th house is a good house, I would say, for things relating to spirituality. And that while I think the 1st house has to do with your like persona in the world, which is pretty well fixed and established during a Saturn and Aquarius period of time. If Mercury retrogrades back into the 12th house, though, there could be a kind of what is the more inner truth of who you are in a spiritual sense, that this kind of Mercury retrograde could be a good opportunity for that kind of stuff, inner soul searching. But however, I don't see it as being a very extroverted social kind of thing. If anything, this is going to be more of an inner look, an introspective kind of process for the Aquarius. For Pisces rising, Saturn in Aquarius lands in the 12th house. Now, this would be kind of an interesting one to try to decipher here. One thing that stands out to me is that Saturn has its joy in the 12th house. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the system of joys, I wouldn't get too happy about it because in this context, Saturn in the 12th house, that stands for things like isolation and, I mean, I have mentioned that the 12th house has to do with spirituality, people who go live in monasteries or hermitages and they have a lot of quiet, introspective time to look within and such. And Saturn is in Aquarius, so it's well dignified. So there might be some potential for that kind of a more of that well dignified 12th house kind of thing. Like I'm picturing, Zen monks have a very militaristic, kind of disciplined kind of way they live in their monasteries, where they have a uniform and a set thing they do at certain times and stuff like that. But the joy of Saturn in its 12th house, the joy of it has more to do with the Saturn's ability to act out what it's known for, kind of thing. And Saturn is generally, it's the planet associated with the winter time, and so there can be a certain feeling of maybe being moody and depressed or isolated that is not really a positive kind of isolation. So, but, I think one thing that's important to consider here is that there could be pros and cons with everything, and not to just read it as one or the other, but rather there's a spectrum which may be applicable to all sorts of people in different ways. We can see Uranus and Taurus in the third house making that square. And the third house has to do with your neighborhood, your siblings, your neighbors. And I consider the third house to have to do with friends, in the sense of being like your brothers and sisters, so to speak. So there's some conflict here, basically, between, I would say, isolation, the tendency to isolate, and Uranus and Taurus is sort of saying, like, hey, why not get more involved in the local neighborhood? Why not get involved with your brothers and sisters? Why not come out and socialize and that kind of thing? Whereas there's some force which is very strongly pushing towards a kind of self-isolation. Of course, this could be read as a coronavirus thing, like maybe people are isolating due to coronavirus measures, but I think that this could also be relevant in other ways. For whatever reason, though, the Aquarius, Saturn in Aquarius time, I would expect to be a fairly isolating period of time for Pisces rising people, because Saturn has its joy in that 12th house, and that's kind of where the level that Saturn in the 12th resonates at, is this level of being kind of feeling like you're separate, you've been separated from the rest of society, and there's some kind of challenge in that from Uranus and Taurus. Kind of, it's kind of like the why, don't you want to come out and play kind of situation, is kind of how I read this kind of chart. And with the Mercury retrograde, there may be given more opportunities to come out and play, if you want to look at that way, because Mercury's retrograding into the 11th house, which has to do with groups. Whereas the third house has to do with more about, your bros. I would say the 11th house has to do more with professional networking, or the kind of connections that we have that are not just people that are close to us and that we're friendly with, but people who are there supporting us in a way that is maybe more purposeful, such as people who support us to reach our career goals, or people who are trying to help our development along in whatever way, like maybe a teacher or a counselor or something like that could be 11th house kind of influence. So Mercury's heading back into the 11th house, so that there is, I would say, an opportunity to maybe come out of your shell a bit for this Mercury retrograde, although it won't last forever, because eventually Mercury is just going to come and bump back into Saturn again when it goes direct, right? So it's like kind of a temporary reprieve from sort of this sense of isolation. Now, the thing is, I'm not reading this as what you should do or shouldn't do. I'm just trying to illustrate the dynamic that is at play. So I would just use that as a word of caution that, especially considering the coronavirus pandemic, it may be actually be in your best interest to isolate. Maybe it's not such a bad thing that there's this kind of isolating force, right? However, maybe that's detrimental, and maybe it would do you a lot of good to get out and go and socialize. I'm not going to give you the answer. You're going to have to figure this one out yourself. But yeah, it's those are the dynamics to isolate or to come out and be social. And how are you going to navigate those during a Mercury retrograde? Yeah. That's something to look into. To close off, I will just mention a few things about Mercury retrogrades. For one thing, when a planet goes retrograde, it's actually physically closer to the Earth than when it's in direct motion. And so, for some planets, like I would say Venus and Jupiter are particularly good for this because they're bright in the sky. That if you could catch Jupiter retrograde, it's going to look a lot bigger in the sky physically than when it's in direct motion. Now, the physical appearance of the planet as being larger in the sky, it also has a kind of a symbolic meaning that goes with the retrograde. It's said that when a planet is retrograde, because it's closer to the Earth, it actually has a stronger influence on people and on events. So, but it's not stronger in a way that like you're like, oh, I'm going to get some Mercury stuff done with this and be productive with it because Mercury's so potent. It's more about strong in the way of like inhabiting your blind spot and having power over you in a way you may not realize. That it's like strong, not necessarily strong in the way that we would like it to be strong. And so there could be, like, I'm not the kind of person who thinks that Mercury retrogrades are like a really big deal in terms of like everything's going to go wrong because it's Mercury retrograde. But the point is that when a planet's retrograde, it's more likely to be kind of like, I would say with Mercury especially, the trickster quality could come up in that it's kind of slippery. Like you think you think you can get something going with Mercury, and then it kind of it's like a slippery fish. It eludes your ability to grasp it and make it work for you, and it might slip out into being something different. And so that's kind of generally why people say with Mercury retrograde to avoid doing certain things, because they may not turn out as you were expecting, or there's a little bit more of a kind of chaotic element of chance or randomness with Mercury retrograde. And we're also having a Venus retrograde at the same time. Eventually, Venus and Mercury will be both together in Capricorn, both retrograde, but that only lasts a couple of days. But I think it also applies to Venus, too, is that Venus may be, when Venus is retrograde, the influence Venus has may be something that's more unconscious, that Venus has power over our blind spots. And it's just another reason why I think possibly why people make a big deal about retrogrades is that it's a time when astrology is particularly useful because there's more of a need to see what's happening with these planets when they're not traveling in their usual motion, when they're a bit more, following this retrograde cycle. They're more able to have some sort of unconscious power over us. And when it comes to Mercury retrogrades, of course, the common thing for them to be associated with is various technical problems, whether that is mechanical breakdowns or, things getting lost in the mail or miscommunications and all that kind of thing. I didn't really spend a lot of time on that in this video, though, because, that's everybody knows that already, right? But I thought I'd just throw it in at the end to sort of remind you of that part of it too. I don't think that you need to put your entire life on hold just because it's Mercury retrograde or Venus retrograde or whatever the case may be. But that being said, I think that the strategy of delaying things and being patient and waiting for things is I would say it's an underrated strategy, basically. That I think our culture puts a lot of emphasis on this attitude that you can have it all now. You just have to do X, Y, and Z. You know what I mean? Like, the world could be yours. You just need to invest in our product or whatever it is. Like it's all like, what are you waiting for? You get the life that you want is yours for the taking. You just have to have the balls to grab it. Don't let Mercury retrograde get in your way. No, now's a better time than ever. Go out there and achieve what you need to do, and all this kind of like that. I think that the attitude in our society is a bit too much like that, anyways. And so the voice that says, "No, don't have everything right now. Wait until the right time." That's like a kind of an underrepresented voice in our culture, and I think that is one of the things that maybe astrology and other divination methods may have to offer our society is a sense that the world doesn't revolve around us. Like, we're not egomaniacs that we can just exert our willpower stronger and get whatever we want, that there are actually times when it's conducive to doing something and times when it's not conducive to doing something. And by being a baby and throwing a temper tantrum isn't going to get you what you want. You might have to actually learn to be patient and or even just learn to do without something. You know what I mean? Like, it's not even about waiting in order to get what you want, but to experience the absence of something. What is it like to not get what you want and not have any sign that it's going to come? You know what I mean? And to deal with that absence. If I go too much into that kind of conversation, I have a feeling I may not be a very popular astrologer, though. But I think these are kind of some of the things that astrology has the advantage in being able to open up. Anyways, whatever. That's my. This is my little ramble at the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for whatever I decide to do next when it comes to astrology.